Greetings, Modernism in the Museum students. I hope you're well. Happy Friday, and greetings from Los Angeles. Um, I would like to talk a little bit about some of the often overlooked aspects of the museum exhibition. And the museum exhibition as a as not just an inert, static space of singular objects, but a dynamic narrative, a story, a syntax, um, a way that structures thought and encourages particular kinds of experiences. Some of those experiences are planned, and some of them are not. Many of them are not. They leave kind of an open-ended experience. First of all, one thing I'd like you to do when you go to art museums is to look at the so-called tombstone information of each individual work of art. That's the wall label. The label will include the name of the artist, the title, the dimensions, the materials that's used, the size. It will also mention, and this is what I would want you to focus upon, the last line is what year the work entered the permanent collection of the museum and what funds purchased it, whether it was certain purchase funds, whether it was the gift from a collector. And what you can do is as you begin to go through an exhibition, looking at an exhibition of works from the permanent collection or the permanent collection installations, you can begin to get a sense of the story of each particular institution, its own collection, how the collection came to be. So it's not insignificant to know that a particular painting by an artist didn't enter the collection until 1990, or that it had been a work had been in the collection since the early 1920s. That the work has, in many ways, participated in defining the reputation or the identity of the institution, or that there are particular collectors who have a constant presence, that they have gifted the works to the permanent collection. Those aspects are very insightful and very important in terms of understanding the history of the institution. For not only does the art museum as a generic institution emerge within modernity, each institution, each museum as an institution has its own particular history. Wherever that institution is, whether it's in New York or Los Angeles, or it's in Omaha, Nebraska, or Kansas City, Missouri, or St. Louis, Missouri, or Anchorage, Alaska, each institution has its own history, has its own collections, predicated upon the resources that they have, the collectors, etc. So if you look at that information, you're able to get a sense of you can begin to put together a particular history of the institution. Moreover, a curator will intend to produce or generate a certain narrative, and will do so not just with isolated artworks, but those works in forming a conversation, those works that are speaking to each other from across the wall, or that are speaking to each other next to each other, that emphasize differences or emphasize similarities, that find ways to be able to tell a particular kind of story that only that institution with those particular works of art can tell. An institution, say, that's having a curator that's curating an exhibition from the museum's permanent collection can only use an example of de Kooning's work that they have in the collection, or only use a particular example of an Edward Hopper painting that's in their collection. They can't use those other paintings. But if the curator wants to curate a loan show of Edward Hopper's or de Kooning's paintings of women, she can request loans from various institutions. But going through a museum's permanent collection will offer a lot of insight into the particular identity of the institution. And maybe that's a particular project that some of you might be interested in. Use the example that we've had with the Museum of Modern Art and focus on your neighborhood museum. Focus on your favorite museum. Offer a particular kind of institutional history. Who are the directors? What were the kind of important role that certain acquisitions played in the identity of the institution? Or focus on a particular exhibition. Another aspect of the narrative that's produced is a more experiential narrative, one that's more open-ended. It's not just a list of works in the exhibition, but how they're installed in the exhibition room, so that it takes into account the ambulatory nature of the viewer walking through the gallery spaces, looking at work, circling back, noticing a work out of the corner of their eye and moving into that exhibition space. That's part of the aesthetic experience of the work, and that the curator can plan some of those interactions. Those connections have intended certain comparisons, certain contrasts, certain focus points. But the curator can't plan all of those kind of serendipitous moments in which the viewer is surprised by a work, happens upon a work, will, because of the viewer, see certain relationships that the curator doesn't even realize. There were lots of occasions in which I would be talking with with a group of a museum exhibition that I'd curated, and a person would talk about a particular relationship as if I had planned it. And I hadn't. I had to admit to them that, oh, I didn't see that. I didn't see that relationship. But it's that unplanned aspect of the relationship that is also part of what the planning is. You're planning for the unplanned. You're opening up. You're not making the exhibition function as a didactic lecture. You are opening the exhibition up to the person walking through it, and what catches their eye and what surprises them as they turn the corner, and all of those aspects that will emphasize the kind of instantaneous or sudden revelation of experiencing works of art that is part of what the museum can offer the viewer. One of the problems of listening to the audio lectures is that it cuts you off from that. It moves you from particular artwork to particular artwork rather than allowing you to move through it and to engage with others walking through it, and to be mindful and aware of where you actually are and where your body is in the space. I've always found the art of curating to be very much an embodied experience, one that affirms the human body, one that affirms the person who's walking through and has a particular kind of personal relationship. And so that aspect is something that I think is very important. And then something else I wanted to bring to your attention was a little more information regarding this notion of the evolving torpedo. Alfred Barr's idea that the Museum of Modern Art would only hold temporarily collections of art, that after the work, a particular painting or a particular sculpture or another work in another media was in the museum's collection for 75 years, it would then be transferred to the Met. It would become a classic. It had run out of its modern spirit, you could say, and had become a historical relic or a masterpiece of a kind that was different than art that was engaging the present. What is interesting is that the founders of the Museum of Modern Art, the collectors, were collectors that had in their collections paintings within post-impressionism. Cézanne, Seurat, Van Gogh, and Gauguin. Primarily those four artists that were working on the tail end and the cusp of Impressionism, so in the third quarter of the 19th century. And they had gifted their work to the museum. And those exhibitions, those works were the first sources of Alfred Barr's exhibitions in 1929, 1930. What is important and what's interesting is that as Barr is making his argument that the museum should not have a permanent collection, through Barr's efforts, his exhibitions, his scholarly work, the value in the art historical value, and also simply the capital financial value of the works became more and more important. And so by the time it came time, by the mid-50s, that you could transfer those works to the Met was more than happy to have the work because it had reputation and capital and importance attached to it. And certainly those collectors that had given those works to the Met were loath to let them go. They did not want those works to be part of the Met. They had started the Museum of Modern Art in many ways as a way of countering the Met. And so they resisted, and there was a rift on the board, there was much controversy, and the decision then was made in the mid-1950s to not follow that path, which meant modernism, instead of this evolving torpedo or this movement through time that was moving in these 75-year increments, meaning modernism was relative to the moment where we are living. That modernism then in the visual arts, modern art, you could say, had a starting point, and that starting point, not coincidentally, was the work of Cézanne, Gauguin, Seurat, and Van Gogh. They became the beginning of modern art. So instead of this notion of a kind of dynamic, dialectic, a movement through time, it had a starting place, which meant instead of it moving through time in a flexible way, in a transitory way, having a starting point, it's like stretching, it was then stretched from the 1880s, like a rubber band that was stretched. And the difficulty and the challenge was to try to always make Gauguin and Cézanne and the work of the post-impressionists alive again in the present. And the more difficult that that occurred, the more stress that this rubber band of modernism had. And the development of postmodernism, you could argue, in the context of the visual arts, is the product of the snapping of the rubber band. That the Museum of Modern Art couldn't generate a compelling narrative that continued to include Gauguin and Cézanne and Van Gogh and the work of postmodern painters in the 1980s. That Basquiat and Warhol and Julian Schnabel in the 1980s couldn't be reconciled with the work of Gauguin and Van Gogh. So much was the stress on that narrative that what ended up happening is something else had to be made. Another story, another narrative. What's interesting is the Museum of Modern Art is now becoming more and more the Met of modernism. It has the beginning point and, in some ways, an ending point. And the new contemporary modern is PS1 in New York City. It's MoMA's contemporary site. And so then you have this notion of what is modern and what is contemporary. Could be an interesting project for some of you to look at is what takes place at the new millennium around 2000. I mean, the Museum of Modern Art reinstalls its permanent collection galleries, and it generates a number of exhibitions from its permanent collections called Modern Starts. And they begin to reinvent the idea of what it means for MoMA to be a museum of modern art. And in fact, I think one of the texts I've given you or will be assigning you is a text by Eleanor Hartney in which she reviews the reinstallation of the permanent collection around 2000, in which different narratives are attempted. One that's less influenced by Alfred Barr and the formalist narrative. And the Museum of Modern Art is again engaged in reinstalling its permanent collection, rethinking its permanent collection, trying to figure out new narratives that can bring it more in line and in conversation with postmodernity and contemporary artistic practice as well. But it's very interesting that you could say that it's the collectors, the wives of the industrialists, Lily Bliss, Frank Rockefeller, and other ladies who had these, that were concerned about the arts, that were concerned about modern art. It's their collection that forms the kernel, the centerpiece of the Museum of Modern Art's collection, and defines what it means, what modern means. So I hope these thoughts are helpful to you. Have a great weekend, and I will write you on Monday, again from Los Angeles. And I look forward to seeing you then. Take care.